Welcome to Not Another CEO podcast. I'm your host, David Politis. Every week, we talk to inspiring leaders and get the true stories, the ups and downs, the lessons learned, and come away with actionable advice for our own journeys. Today's guest is one of the smartest operators I've ever worked with. He was a very early hire at BetterCloud and played a huge role in the success of the business. 5 years ago, he left to start his own company. There are few people that I believe in more than him, and I immediately invested in his new company. This May, after nearly 5 years of operating the business, raising over $7 million, building product, bringing on customers, he made the incredibly hard decision to shut down the company. He recently started to share his experiences and lessons learned with the broader founder community. What he is doing is a true gift to other founders and aspiring founders. Most venture-backed companies fail, but nobody talks about those failures. Please welcome founder, former CEO at Workstream.io, and now author of Failing Forward, a Substack where he is sharing the wisdom learned from startup failures, Nick Freund.
Thanks, David. That was an introduction. I gotta bring my game face for today.
All right, let's jump right into it. Nick, what is the one thing that you did at Workstream, big or small, that had the biggest impact and you'll absolutely do again when you're CEO of another company in the future?
Yeah, there's so many things that I think go into building a business, building a great business, but it all starts with a team. And as a founder, you should know what you know, and you should know what you don't know. And I knew from the very beginning that I needed to bring on a co-founder and to bring on a CTO. What we were building was very technically complex and complicated. It was a big build. It's why we spent one of the many reasons we spent a lot of time, why we spent a lot of money building the product. And so I recruited my co-founder, Chris Ibarra, and it was kind of unconventional because we had never worked together before. And so I remember we talked about this. I talked to investors about this, and they kind of thought I was crazy to hire somebody or to co-found with somebody that I hadn't had work experience with before. But Chris was a great hire. And I think the process by which we got to know each other and made that decision together, I'd absolutely do again. And I think of all of the decisions we made at the company, many of which were not right, that was one that we really got right.
So I remember when you were going through that process and you were really you spent a lot of time talking to a number of people. And I remember even when you got to Chris and the references you were doing on Chris and the ones he was doing on you. And can you just talk maybe about that process? How long did that process take from beginning to end, for example?
Yeah, I mean, from when I left BetterCloud, where I work for you, to starting the company was 6+ months. And I had the idea already. And most of that time was spent finding Chris. And I think I imagine this will resonate with you, but I think one of the things about your co-founder or like those core members of your early team, in a lot of ways, that's much more of like a marriage than it is a like employee-employer relationship. And so that process feels in a lot of ways much more like dating than it does interviewing somebody. So of course I spent a lot of time. I probably spoke with 10 plus like really good engineering leaders that I considered. And we spent a lot of time. I mean, there's an aspect of getting to know each other and feeling that there's personality fits, which is really important. Because you end up spending more time with your co-founder than kind of anyone else in your family. We ended up doing remotely for a number of reasons, including the fact that we got started like during the pandemic. But you're spending more time with that person than your wife, than with your kids. If you don't like that person, well, if it works, you're going to spend 10, 15, 20 years. So I think we really approach it much more with a dating mindset than anything. And that was lots of sessions, getting to know each other, what motivated each other, interviewing each other. And then we spent time working together. And so before we made any type of like formal decision to work together, at some point you've got good juju going with this person. You're like, well, let's see what actually happens. And so we spent a bunch of time actually in working sessions together over a couple of weeks, kind of trying before we bought. Um, and so kind of all of that happened, and that took 2-3 months. Um, and I had gotten introduced to Chris through the the former VP of engineering at Better Cloud, actually. And so I hadn't worked with Chris before, but he was through a trusted, third party, right? A trusted person that Chris and I had both worked with. So we spent a bunch of time getting to that point, and then we were kind of ready. And so we wanted to do even more diligence. So we did mutual references. So he gave me like 3 or 4 folks that he had worked for or worked with in the past, and I spoke with them, and then vice versa. And I think that was really, really helpful in understanding more what their working style was like, what made that person tick, what they did when things weren't going well, which in our case turned out to be really, really important. Like Chris had been through a pivot before. I knew that going into it because I had talked to the founder of Rody, where he was like the founding head of engineering. And so I knew that he was capable of that, and that he could be like a steely-eyed missile man through that type of storm. And then I think the last thing that we did was we actually did a double date with our wives. And we all got together and just got to know each other a little bit more. And all of that kind of happened. I mean, all of that happened before we made a formal decision to work together and found the company and really hammer out like what our founder deal was.
Wow. I think I think the way you just described it is so right. It's really a marriage in so many ways, especially if you're going to spend 5, 10, 15 years together building. I I don't know if it's just right now. I'm not exactly sure, but I've been seeing a lot of early stage companies who have very real founder problems, like between the founders, and it is really messy. Actually, I have not seen that in a company that I've been in, so I'm witnessing it in some of these companies, and it is really bad. Like if it goes wrong, the dynamics on a lot of fronts, from cap table dynamics to, investor dynamics to employee dynamic, like it can get really bad. And I think that's a really, no one else in the podcast so far has brought that up, and I feel like it's really important for people to hear that, of take the time and really, you're because there's a lot of these like incubators or accelerators, and they're like, you need a founder, and someone's like goes outside, it's like, anyone a founder, okay, cool, like let's jump into it. But what you're talking about is the right process, the reference checks, doing some work together, having your significant others meet. I think that is really, I think people need to hear that, because I think people sometimes jump into it and you don't realize what could happen down the road if you don't get that hire right.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I think, to your point about you're seeing lots of early stage founder issues. I mean, I don't know this, but we're kind of coming out of this world that was like the world of like the shotgun new startup, right? Where it was like, oh, there was a million ideas out there. Capital was cheap. They were like shoving capital down everyone's throat. They were trying to pluck every like quasi good operator to start a new thing. And so that's a market in which there's just lots of stuff coming together really, really quickly. I think there's something to be said about just being thoughtful about your co-founder and the team that you bring on. And I think just being thoughtful in everything about that, those early sets of decisions when you're founding, about who's your customer and what's your product that you're going to build. And if there's as an early stage founder, you feel the need to go really, really fast. But I think in a lot of ways, you're much better off in that first year and a half, 2 years, maybe just going slow and thoughtfully, because at that point, you have the most flexibility you're ever going to have in the history of the company. Because as soon as you hire a team and you really raise capital and the clock is ticking, you lose that flexibility. And so treasure that flexibility and take your time and be thoughtful in the early days.
Talk to me about how you chose the product and the market you wanted to go into.
Yeah, so I chose the product, let's say half based off of like personal experiences that I had that I felt were a pain point, and half on trends that I saw in the market that made me think that there was a business opportunity. Um, so on the former, at the highest level, the first idea or elevator pitch for our product was, hey, this is Envision for analytics, which is problematic for a number of different reasons that I'm sure we can get into the podcast, including that like Envision itself does not exist anymore. I had that idea because I'd felt that pain point early in my career at Tesla. I'd worked as an analyst. I had been in finance and data, and I'd felt a lot of these pain points around collaborating on models, on financials, and dashboards. And then I also felt a lot of those same pain points at Better Cloud more as an operator on the other side of it. So like I'd felt these personal pain points and I'm like, I think there's something really interesting here and I have a take on it. And then there was a lot of wind in the sails of, let's call it the deep collaboration space at the time. The shtick of deep collaboration was it's persona-based collaboration. You go really deep with a specific persona. It's not super horizontal like Slack. As an example, you pick designers, you pick analysts, you pick video producers, name it, and you build something that's around the productivity tools they already use and it's purpose-built workflow and collaboration. So there's other examples of companies that have been very successful in doing that. And so I felt there was an opportunity. And so it was born off this pain, and I thought this opportunity that I saw, and there were a couple of deep collaboration companies at the time that were growing really fast in New York, and so for that reason as well, it was exciting to me.
When you kind of got off the ground, one of the things you wrote about in the Substack, I think a couple weeks ago, was around that first set of customers. I recently got a text actually after one of the episodes from someone that said, "Can you start asking everyone about how they found their first 5 customers?" And I think you have a very specific view on this, and I agree with that view. Can you share how did you first find the first 5 customers/design partners, and talk a little bit about that process?
Of course, yeah. I mean, so I think there's lots of ways to find your design partners. I think how you engage with them and how you manage those is probably more important. In our case, we had this idea, and we had a product. So, or a conception for a product and like a problem area. So we spent a lot of time in the early days doing customer interview, all of the stuff that you hear. You interview customers, you talk to them about your potential customers, you talk to them about their pain points, all of that stuff. And I probably spoke with more than 50 analyst types between leaving Better Cloud and really getting going. And that starts with kind of initial conversations all the way to like wireframe reviews, and you're actually developing as a design partner alongside them. Look, I think at the highest level, I networked or was referred into people in those early days. And unless you have something unique about your company's founding story, like generally you're a person with an idea or a customer in mind, and maybe some capital. So I think that's how from talking to other early stage founders, I think that's how a lot of this starts, especially if you're just like building something completely new, right? Um, and so it was a lot of like networking and kind of early stage founder selling. And actually, if you have the guts to do it and you have the drive to do it, it's the easiest time to actually engage with people, because you're kind of just asking them for feedback, and people are always interested, especially people who work in tech, or if you're selling like a technical product, they're kind of always interested in learning about new cool things. And if you do a customer interview right, or a potential customer interview right, they feel listened to and they feel valued, right? And so we did lots and lots of those sessions. I think, and I think we generally did it well. From that big cohort of people that we spoke to, eventually you whittled it down to like, hey, we had this problem. We have this sub problem that we are now laser focused on, and here's a potential solution to it. And then you start iterating on what the solution could be. And you end up going from a big list of folks to a pretty small list of people who want to develop the product alongside you.
Before we go to the next thing, I want to call something out there, because you said people that are technical or in the technology space, and I would actually expand it to just most people. I agree with you. They want to know what's coming. What are people working on? They want to feel, this is my, like, they want to be in the know. They want to feel like, oh, I'm in here talking to this. He's about to start a company and he's telling me all this stuff and I can shape what they're doing. Like, that makes people, how often in your day to day job does someone ask you, hey, you're the expert. Tell me what I should go build, and like give me all this. Like, I I talk to people a lot of times who say like, how do I find those people to interview? And my view is like, the entire world of people in that function is your audience, and if you reach out in the right way, I mean, not 100%, but over 50% will respond and say, sure, I'll give you 30 minutes to share my thoughts because you told me I'm an expert in this thing.
Yeah, I mean, kind of when you ask me the question, I'm a little like, that one is actually not that hard to do. If you network, tell people what you're working on and ask them, hey, do you know anyone who fits this customer persona that might be interested in talking to me? A lot of people are going to say, oh, yes, you should meet this person. And that person is almost always going to take that meeting. You can just reach out to people cold on LinkedIn. If you tell people you're a founder who is working on something new and that they're your client and you want their opinion, like, you're going to get a pretty high hit rate. It's a very, very different dynamic in those early days of than selling someone a solution when you're already in market. I mean, there's a really valuable role as for a founder there too, but it's that dynamic is a pretty easy one to navigate if you just have the energy and you genuinely want to engage with people and get their feedback.
So now let's move from there to, okay, so now you've narrowed it down to a subset of these people and they're going to be your design partners. Now let's talk about that.
Yeah. So look, I think and this goes to like a lot of my learnings, right? Like, I left Better Cloud with this idea for a product that I had felt personally. And it was wasn't something that really existed. I felt the need for it personally, but it wasn't something that really existed before. So of course I went into these conversations trying to be really, really open-minded. But like, I think there's just some level of psychology of like, you're looking for some level of confirmation bias. Like, if you have an idea, who whittles down from the 100 people you talk to the 5 that are willing to develop alongside with you, the people that idea resonated the most with, right? I mean, and you gotta be, I think, really, really humble for that not to be the case. And let's be honest, like, most founders aren't the most like humble people in the world. We're just like, we have some level of sickness to us around our ego or intelligence, or whatever it is, that I think that will make that dynamic a challenge. If you approach it instead with, I have a customer I want to build for in mind, that's very different. And you go interview those customers just saying, hey, I want to learn more about you and I want to solve those problems. You could end up in a very, very different place. But that goes, I think, more to like the product you end up building on the, but look, it relates to developing design partners because it's all interrelated, right? I think with developing design partners, the thing that I struggled with the most in the early days was like the balance between getting early validation that you're on a big enough problem and then developing an informal collaborative relationship so that you can get lots of cycles on feedback and people want to give you input and you can develop something that's really valuable to them, right? And that dynamic is really, really hard to navigate. The former, really getting that validation, the only way you get that validation is when people pay you. There's just no way. Like, there's a wide, wide gap between what someone says they're going to do and what they are willing to do. Like, there's no proof that your product is awesome until somebody parts with real dollars for that. So that's the classic argument for like you get customers to sign contracts in the early days. But the challenge with it is you're then like spending a lot of time as an early stage founder chasing the contract when you're like, well, shouldn't we just be iterating on product and developing like an awesome product for this person? So we erred more on the latter. And so we entered into kind of these formal design partnerships with people where I would set expectations with them, and I had a slide and I would tell them what they should expect, and I would invite them to a shared Slack channel, and here's how often I want to connect with you, and X, Y, Z. But all of that is relatively informal. And I was talking with another founder recently about these dynamics, and he shared with me what they were doing, which was having their customers sign a design partnership agreement. And as soon as he told this to me, I was like, this is brilliant. Look, like every client of yours, of course, when you onboard them to your product, they need to sign some level of like terms of service, and hopefully that's like a click-through thing. But like a design partnership contract is a legal contract that you sign with your design partners about what the design program looks like, what their gives and gets are, and what the product you're developing is. And it allows you to do things such as define really clearly upfront, how long is the product free for? And when is it not going to be free anymore? What is it going to cost after that free period? And what's beautiful about all of this is it allows you to once people sign, still have these kind of like informal, let's say relatively lower stakes engagements with you, but it pulls up a lot of the selling that you kind of want to do in a way that's valuable and in a way it's kind of actionable feedback as well. You want your customers to know that this is a real commitment. And when the customers know it's a real commitment, when it's a legal binding document and they've signed it, you've got a different level of commitment from them and buy-in on what you're solving, especially when they know what it's going to cost later on. And if they're not willing to do it, or they have questions or they have feedback, well, what better time to get that feedback than then? I'd much rather have that feedback before I onboard people and they churn from my design partnership program, or quite frankly, I'd rather have that feedback and have them sign the design partnership agreement when I have wireframes, but before we've laid down a line of code, before we spent the engineering resources, because again, that's your most flexible time as a founder. So if you go through all of what I'm saying, and you get to the point and you can't get partners to sign your design partnership agreement, maybe that's a really important piece of feedback that you should be listening to, and you should be doing something else with your time.
If you had done that and you had forced that process with the design partnership agreement with a dollar amount in there, do you think there would be a different path for Workstream if you had done that?
I think there's a likelihood we could have ended up building something different for our V1. Because when we got into it, there was this really big gap between what people said they were going to do during our design program when they would give us feedback and they were talking about the problems they saw us solving, and then what they were actually willing to do when we had the product and I went through onboarding them. And of course there were technology snags that you ran into and all of that stuff. But when customers just ghost you and they stop responding to you, or when customers gaslight you, and by that I mean when they tell you they're going to do something and then start to create excuses for why they're no longer willing to do it, that's a really, really big problem. And I think that goes a lot to how you've set expectations, and are you aligned with them on how you want to engage with them and what problem you're solving and how important that is to them. And that's really hard to ferret out. It's just there's a lot of art there, and so some forcing yourself into some structure, I think, is helpful as much to you as anyone.
Do you from a product perspective, customer perspective, when we're talking about this, we obviously talked a lot as you were building the business, and one of the things that I saw is, as you got towards the end, you started to pivot pretty hard around the product and around the customer, and started to actually have some good traction, at least based on the conversations we were having. Do you think that you waited too long to make that pivot, and make that call in the process?
I mean, factually, yes, because we had this final pivot. We onboarded more customers with the final pivot that fully implemented and integrated our solution in 60 days than in the previous history of the company. But it was too little too late. So just like the brutal honesty is, of course, we waited too long to pivot. If we'd gotten there 2 years earlier, I probably would still be doing that today because the dynamics of our raise and the business and everything about it would have been drastically different. Easier said now, I think, in retrospect, than in the moment. There was false signal. There were other things that were happening. Long story short, there was this MVP product that we developed. That first thing didn't work, so we pivoted into a product that I analogize as Zendesk for data teams. So we ended up really narrowing in on that. We built that. We took that to market. We were monetizing that, and then the kind of everything fell apart around us. And so this is the final pivot, David, that you're talking about. We should have pivoted faster, but seeing the forest through the trees, it was hard. It was hard.
So one of the experiences, again, I'm seeing, it's crazy how much stuff I'm seeing that's it's so similar to what you've gone through. That's why I'm so happy that we're doing this, because so many people are dealing with this. And what I notice, and I want to just see if this is true for you. You and I actually have not talked about this. What I notice with some of the other companies is they're in a situation where they do need to pivot. I mean, they've been hitting their head against the wall and everything, but they're not doing. They know they need to. They think about it, but they're not pulling the trigger. And a couple of them recently told me, the challenge I have is that this isn't what my investors invested in, or, I'm going to run out of money and in 18 months. And if I want the investors to back me, like, there's a lot of stuff about that I hear about the investors, this, my board, this, the VC told me I need to get to profitability tomorrow. And really, and I wonder if was there, and I'm not saying it in like your investors weren't supportive, but more like, do you think mentally that was part of what was holding you back, or was it these false positives that you kept saying, no, that's what I was just waiting for that thing. Oh, I'm just waiting. Where do you think that came from?
Look, so I think there certainly were a bunch of false positives. Like when you take a product, this is the product we pivoted off of. You take a product, you launch it, and then within 4 months, it gets 100K in ARR. That's in retrospect, a really, really unhelpful false positive. Because you're looking at that and you're like, well, why shouldn't we be able to get to $1 million in ARR in another year? I signed these contracts myself. We just went to market. Like, the product is going to get so much better. We're doing all of these things to get the word out there. You're creating all this pipeline. So there's a situation where you have that, and then suddenly things start falling apart against you, or around you. The false positives are difficult, and I don't want to look past those as much as for anyone who's listening. This is possible because, like, if you're hesitant to pivot, you probably have false positives that you might be pointing to that might be holding you back. But I do think there's another part to it, David, which you're talking to, which is, let's call it the sunk cost fallacy. And anyone who's played poker knows should know the sunk cost fallacy. But if David, you and I are playing poker and you go all in and half of my stack is already in the middle of the table, but I know you have me beat, I got to fold because it's sunk costs, right? Like I can't win the dollars and I shouldn't be chasing money that I've already spent. I should just be thinking about the dollars that are still in my hand. The sunk cost fallacy, I think it plays a major role in your psychology. Because every dollar that you've spent, every conversation that you've had, every investor that you've brought on board, every customer that you've brought on board, you have spent actual capital or emotional capital or political capital on that. And your ego, your life force as a founder gets like muddled up with it. I'm like a huge fantasy nerd, David, as you know, and there's like this quote from Lord of the Rings about how Sauron pours his life force into the one ring and he becomes inextricably bound with that. But that's the nature of when you're building something and you're building a product, and like that, as much as the money that you might have spent is going to hold you back, because you have to admit to yourself that I was wrong. You got to go tell everyone else I was wrong. You were wrong. We were all wrong. This isn't working. But you know what? You have to do that because it's a fallacy. And your investors in the end don't fucking care. Sorry, I don't know if you're going to have to bleep me or not. Your investors aren't going to fucking care. What do your investors care about in the end is you make them money. Like, sure, maybe they had a thesis on why they invested, but they're not going to necessarily be precious about that if you can pivot into something that works. And I think if you're in this place where you're feeling that holding you back, well, you probably know, right?
Do you think so? One of the things, timing wise, you basically got hit with kind of the worst timing possible in terms of the market. But I guess my question is, do you feel like this is, and you've seen Better Cloud and you've seen all that, like, do you think you have to be lucky or like good to be successful? Like when you think about the experience, and again, you've had this experience yourself, like, and you've been in very successful companies. Did you have to be lucky or good?
I mean, the short cop out is both, of course. I think the more complicated answer or opinion on this is I think the overnight massive successes that it gets everyone excited about being a founder, that's luck. Like, is Mark Zuckerberg the most brilliant founder in the world? Like, I can tell you he's clearly built like $1 trillion business, but like I was at Harvard undergrad when the Facebook launched. I'm like user like 400 on the Facebook or something. And so did he have some like master plan for world domination, or did he just build this thing that like hit the zeitgeist at the time and it just went crazy? To me, that's luck. And there's so many examples of that. I think the more of the founders who are successful and who I admire are the ones who grinded for a really long period of time and figured it out. And those are the 15, 20-year long journeys to the $1 billion exit or whatever it was. They're amazing stories. Those require a healthy dose, I think, of both luck and let's call it personal agency. I think the question is, of course, what matters more? I don't know. I failed. So I want to think that luck plays the bigger role than personal agency. It certainly plays a big role. We started building and we got hit with the pandemic right away. And you could argue that there's this bear market for tech, but that also creates lots of competition, especially with an enterprise. So all of these companies are now chasing enterprise opportunities. And then you can't forget, like, in the background, there's like stuff that are happening in founders' lives. So like, I was a COVID refugee with my family for the first year of COVID while we're trying to, like, that wasn't good luck. I almost lost my sanity during the SVB meltdown. Now we got our money back, but that was like a distraction, like a really unhelpful distraction when we had a year of runway left that consumed me for like a month. That's not good luck. And then of course, just like let's say the broader macro trends, which like created this triple whammy effect for us, because milestones in venture like slipped way back on what you had to prove in order to get to the next round, and budgets tightened at the same time. So getting to that same dollar of revenue was like 5 times harder, if not more, and you need $5 more of revenue for like this to get to the same, like, let's say, financing milestone. So that was bad luck too. I think throughout the course of the company, Chris and I kept saying to each other, like, we have gotten no luck. We need some luck. We need something to break our way. And I think at the end, the kind of the final pivot that we had, that was like, there was luck that was involved with it. Like, there was a lot of, I think, personal agency that went into seeing that and executing that and all of that. But like, the fact that we onboarded all those clients at the very, very end, that there was an element of luck there, but it wasn't enough luck because it was at the end, right? So I don't know if it's 20/70 or 20/80 or 80/20 one way or the other, but you're going to need both. You're going to need both as a founder. And most founders, the role of personal agency is going to prove to be really, really important. But I think it's important longitudinally more than in any one given moment, because founding's a really, really long grind. And so like, one specific decision you make probably matters less than the sum of all of the decisions you're going to make over a period of time, and your ability to like rapidly learn and iterate, especially like in the early days. There's something you said that I then like later took, which was, it's not important that I always make the right decision. It's important that I make a lot of good decisions fast.
It's one of the interesting things. There was this book. I wish I could remember who wrote it, but there was a book. I think it was called "Once You're Lucky, Twice You're Good" or something like that, and it was all about tech founders, like in the first .com wave, and essentially these people who hit it big. Something happened, and the company sold for $1 billion, but it was just hit the market at exactly the right time. And then there's the people, the Ben Horowitzes of the world, or who've done it 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and there you can't be lucky 4 times. Like, you can be lucky once, maybe once and a half, but like, and I look at a lot of the companies, the enterprise software companies that were built, 4 years, 5 years pre-COVID, and really were at the right place at the right time, where when COVID hit and everyone went home, and you had these platforms that were kind of going along, 1 million of ARR, 2 million, and then they went to like 50 million, then 150 million. And what's interesting is you can actually see, of course, from Better Cloud, you can see the data where like actually a lot of these companies have almost, 10% active usage, 12% active usage. But because you got all those customers in those days, you basically have this recurring revenue stream like AOL or something that just basically just keeps coming in. But that is just luck. Like, that's just, and now you have 100 something million of revenue that you can milk to go do the next thing. But the series of events, when you had to start the company, when you had to raise the round, when a pandemic had to hit, that everyone had to go work from home, like the things that had to occur for you to hit all of those milestones like that. And so I think it's something that it sucks to actually admit that. And I think many founders, this is again, these things that I'm so happy that you're sharing, because you can sit there and say, yeah, of course, it's your decisions. You could have pivoted faster. You could have this, you could have, like, sure. But there's this thing where you can't control a lot, about what is happening around your business. And that's important for people to keep in mind.
Yeah. What also makes us, I think, as founders really uncomfortable, because there's a lot of things about the founder mentality, but it's generally, I think, a personality that wants some level of control and autonomy, and to do their and to do their own thing. I mean, like, you're starting a business, right? Which is objectively kind of crazy thing to do. One of the reasons you do that is for control, for like the idea that you can be like a king or a sovereign, right, of your own little castle. To admit that, like, that actually what might happen to you is outside of your control. That's really hard. That's scary.
Let me ask you, I mean, we all know the answer, but what was the most challenging thing you had to deal with at Workstream?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think the obvious one here is just shutting it down. I mean, I think getting to that decision, and then going through the process of it, both of those things were incredibly difficult, incredibly stressful. Um, and, um, people ask me how I'm doing now, and I'm like, I already dealt with the stressful stuff because we had to shut it down. Um, I think, getting to the shutdown, and it depends on how much you want me to go into the details there, but like, just me getting to that point, Chris getting to that point, our investors getting to that point, that was hard.
How long from the moment you started thinking about it to when you told everyone, like, that's the final decision? Was that a 1 week period, 1 month, 6 months? How long from when it really came in your mind that this is something that's a real
Like, that we're shutting down, or like it's a possibility?
that when you went from it's a possibility in your mind to we are shutting down, not the actual shutdown, which took longer. We can talk about that, but I'm saying from the point where you had that idea, I assume talk to Chris, whoever, to the point that you made the decision. What was that? How long was that?
I mean, from when the decision was made to like communicating it was like 48 hours,
How long did it take to come to the decision?
6 months, because we were pivoting. Like, we got our product 100K in ARR in 4 months, and it all stopped. It all stopped. I couldn't move a deal. Like, adoption was dropping off. Like, the tenor of the conversations changed. You couldn't get people to show up to meetings. People showed up to who did show up to meetings would say, "Hey, we're not buying anything right now, but we'll take a look at this thing." So at that, you're looking at this and you're like, we do not have enough time. Like, if this continues, we do not have enough time to really do anything. Like, to get to, like, I needed to get from like 100 to 200, 250K in order to like do a seat extension. At that point, you're like, well, why do I have any reason to believe that's going to happen, much less getting to like Series A milestones? So that was let's call that October. That was a little more than a year ago, and we shut down at the end of April, the beginning of May. So whatever, it's 6-7 months ish. So you're looking at that point, you're like, well, do we just shut it down now? And we had this idea for this one final pivot, and I'm just not one to give up. And so I was like, screw it. We have some customer buy-in here. Let's try it. And so the process of trying to save it through that, which we almost did, that's kind of what took a long time to get through. And you're kind of then trying to jam everything, like a reboot in some ways of the company, into like 6 months when the clock is ticking, with difficult and challenging investor dynamics, a team in real burn, and like hard team decisions and stuff, right? So that took a lot of time. From shutdown call to communication to team was like 48 hours, and then the next month was when communicate comms to, let's say, the broader group of stakeholders. And from when we went to being a entity everyone believed was a going concern to one that everyone knew was shutting down, that was like about a month.
What was the hardest part of that process? Was it your own processing? Was it telling the team, telling your investors, telling the customers? I know all of them were terrible. We talked a lot during that period. What was the worst?
The worst was telling the team. especially because the market was so challenging. It still is challenging for, I mean, how many companies have shut down. I mean, these are people that we got the team really right. Like, we pivoted, we never hit breakaway, any of that stuff. But like, we kept a really good group of talent together. And people were happy and they were engaged and they believed in what we were doing. These people didn't do anything wrong, and you're having to lay them off, you know? Um, and look, I think every CEO, every leader has been through firing somebody or laying off a lot of people. Those are all challenging. But for me, it was like, it was laying everyone off. And it wasn't, it was a small, it was 10, look, it was 10, 11 people, right? So you really know the people really well. They've bled for you and you feel like you're dumping them on the market. That was really, really hard. I was like crying on the call. I let everyone know. Um, yeah, that was hard.
How did you deal with kind of the personal side of it? And, you have a growing young family, and, you dedicated 5 years, to your point, not during hard times, to build this. How did that play into your decision making?
I mean, there's so much, I think, I would say there in general. I think building a family and building a company at the same time, it's just like certainly not for the faint of heart. And I've always had a really intense career. And so I knew it was kind of like logically crazy, but well, I've always had an intense career. So like, is it going to be that different? Now, of course, we then had 2 kids after I started the company, and we already had a kid. So that was interesting. But I think just it's hard to appreciate those sets of dynamics. And I think that the difference for me was just the level of existential stress that is on your like shoulders as a founder. It's just, you can't replicate that no matter what else that you do. And so dealing with that plus the intensity in parallel to like a young family is like I don't know, it's a unique set of torture, let's call it. I think, there was a couple of really, really tough times I personally had in like the middle of the company. And they honestly, they happened right at the time when we started to monetize. And so at like literally we got to our first dollars at the same time my daughter Isabella was born 7 weeks early, effectively. So she was in the NICU. And then at this exact same time, my brother passed away, which he was a founder in his own right. He was one of the co-founders of Bleacher Report, very troubled person, beautiful person. But all that happening at the same time was personally very, very difficult for me I think for anyone, right? And then you have adding a founder element and stress to the mix where you're trying to monetize. One of the most interesting things for me about, I think, that time was how coming out of it really changed, I think, my perspectives and motivations for what mattered the most to me and why I was doing what I did. And so much of how I built my career and why I was motivated up into that point in some way, shape, or form was about like fulfilling my own personal ego of being somebody that was capable of being a founder, right? And all of the things that you get, title and money and all of the things that come with your career, at least for me, a lot of that was seen through the perspective of like, let's say it was like fulfillment that, again, I was like uniquely capable of my ego, that like I can do this too. And like I think coming out of that, you come through some serious tragedy, and I came out with like a very different motivation, which was like, I still am dying. Like I really, really want to be successful, but ultimately that success is an enabler for something that's much, much more important. Um, so I think getting there, I learned a lot, I think, about myself, and I became a different person through that experience. And I'm like writing a piece about it right now. So we're getting like a preview of it on the show. It'll probably be out before maybe it'll be out before the show's published. But like, you talk a lot about founders pivoting, but like, what is a founder to do when you pivot your motivation when you have a company? When like what drives you changes. So that was very, very interesting. But what the reason I bring it up in the context of your question, David, was that helped me a lot at the end, because I knew at that point why I was continuing to do what I was doing and what was most important to me. And in those darkest times that I had, when I was in grief or whatever, like I had these moments where I was like, I don't want my company to fail. I don't want to fail, but like I can survive that if it happens. But I can't survive like letting my family down. And so for me, that was right. And so coming to the end, I felt uniquely armed for that experience. And it was still really, really difficult. I'm not saying it wasn't really, really difficult. But you felt more armed and to go through the stress. And then at least at the end of it, look, when you shut your company down on the personal front and the family front, there's grief. Like it is also like mourning something. Like I poured, to use that analogy, like I poured 4 years of my life force into this thing. And now it doesn't exist other than like on my LinkedIn profile. You mourn that, right? But I think the silver lining, if you're like a founder listening to this that is going through anything like this, is like there's some level of relief at the end, especially if you're armed with a really good why for what you do. Because that journey getting there is so hard.
Yeah, I think when you talk about, one of the things I think as professionals, I mean, depends on the personality, but generally speaking, as professionals, like for me, for you, for a lot of the people we know, you get to a certain place in your career by being so intense, by taking on that stress, but you really have nothing to worry about other than like if you're that focused on work and wanting to be successful, you really put everything into that. And um, even if you get married, if your spouse is into their work and into your work, like it's the kind, but when you start to have kids, it changes a lot. When you start to have these situations happen and you say, wow, like is that the only way to go about this? Is that and I am torn, I say this a lot on the podcast and to people. I am torn on this for myself personally because I feel like part of my special sauce is the ability to work and work through all this stuff and the work, and that to me is like, but now I have a family and kids that I want to spend time with and wife that I want to go have dinner with and not be at the office until 9 o'clock every night. And so I don't know. I actually don't know how to do it. And I believe, and actually what a lot of guests have said, like there are just sacrifices you cannot be great at it's impossible to be have all your friends, take care of yourself personally and health wise, and also take care of your family, and also build this huge like there's not enough hours. It's impossible. At least in my opinion, I believe, and you have to essentially prioritize what is it that you're going to do. And if you want to do the family and the company, you probably are going to sacrifice yourself and all your friends and something else,
Yeah, totally. I mean, I sacrificed a lot of my own personal health, Um, and there were sacrifices I think I made on both the family before this time, like especially where I pivoted my motivation. I made lots of sacrifices like across both. but your why certainly will inform quite a bit about like how you sacrifice and where you sacrifice. But sacrifices are required. They certainly are required. And I think the interesting question is like, who's the CEO you'd rather be? Would you rather be the CEO that doesn't have like some of these complications that force hard sacrifices? Well, maybe that makes the argument for, I think, or the CEO that doesn't care is that, well, they can be laser focused on just the business, right? But what if it fails? And what are you left with?
Right.
And most companies fail.
Right. That's true. It's a good point. Let's continue on this. So do you want to be CEO again? Is that are you building another company right now? Is that the plan?
I mean, the answer is I'm not building another company right now. What I have done and what I'm passionate about is like technology, building technology, bringing technology to market. And there's an aspect of like, I find the building of the business really interesting, but I also find like the technology itself really, really interesting. Like when I was a kid, I had a book that I would just like flip through like every night before going to bed, like how things work. And it was just like, how does a windmill work? And how does the wheel work? And anyways, this is a book that I had as a kid, but like I was always interested in like peeling apart the technology and understanding it. And I think that says something about why I do what I do. So I find it hard to believe that I'm not going to go start something again. No, in fact, like I know I want to start something again. And I'm going to do that. But I'm not doing that right now. It's for all of the reasons, it requires just a lot. And I won't say I underestimated what was required the first time around. Or I'll say that I feel like I underestimated it, as any first time founder underestimated it. And so I have an appreciation for it, and I'm just not ready yet. So the answer is I'm going to build something again, not tomorrow. I think, right now, when I think a lot about what makes me tick and why I'm writing when I'm writing, why I try to be so brutally honest about the experience, is that being a founder is really hard. There's a lot of luck involved. A lot of folks fail. And like, we just could use all the help we can get. And so I'm really passionate right now about just helping as many people as possible not repeat my mistakes and not fail. And that's another way of helping at the macro level, cool tech come to market, right? But in a different way. And there's a personal connection that I feel to that too. So I'm, right now that's what I'm doing.
Can you talk a little bit about the Substack? Like just what is failing forward and what does that look like? Like how's it manifesting itself?
Yeah, so it's failing forward right now. It's a Substack. You can go there. There's a bunch of articles up. failingforward.substack.com. And there's two primary reasons that I'm doing it. It's a number of articles. The ones I'm really focused on right now are kind of specific lessons that are all grounded in something that happened at the company that I think is broadly applicable, something that happened in the company, something that happened to me that is broadly applicable to other founders. And I'm doing it both to pay forward those lessons, and also for myself as a way to meditate and move forward from what has happened. And I mean, there's something cathartic about it, but there's also something about revisiting what happened and thinking about it and being brutally honest about why that happened so that you can be better in the future. And I feel like collectively, as people, as like ecosystem as a community, if we actually spent more time looking at these failure stories, we might be better, right? I feel like there's not enough of that, and so I want to like lead by example and pay it forward as much as I can. So there's the Substack. I'm trying to write an article kind of every week right now. There's some other creative ideas I have, for example, about using all of my investor updates, which were like, as David, you know, were long and detailed, and I set them out all the time, and repurposing those and making those into useful assets for other founders. Um, things like that. It's been nice. People are like, will reach out to me when I write something, and some people have resonated with them.
I was gonna say, what's the feedback been so far?
The feedback has been really, really positive. I mean, I have people who write back, when I post them on social, and they'll write back, in comments, like but the more meaningful ones are the ones that are like the DMs, where people will reach out and they're like, hey, I'm experiencing this right now and I don't feel comfortable talking about this publicly. Here's kind of like a little bit of what's going on. And so there's been a bunch of that, kind of that back and forth, and people will reach out, and they'll just want to talk. Right. And
Are you engaging with these like, are you doing anything like with them?
yeah, I mean, there's like, I have some folks that I'm like actually like helping kind of as a consultant advisor type of thing. And then there's a lot of folks that just like want to talk. It's interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot since like Failing Forward came out, and there's like the squishy term for like a coach that people use, and there's like kind of two main forms to it. There's like an executive coach, which like I've had an executive coach, and they can be valuable, but like there's and then there's like a CEO coach who like is an executive coach who like focuses really on CEOs, right? But most of that, to an extent, is very interpersonal. There's a lot of like, how do you manage a team? How do you inspire? How do you lead? How do you have a difficult conversation? All of those things. But being a founder, like there's this thing from Brian Chesky from Airbnb about like founder mode versus CEO mode recently, I think on X. Anyways, there's a different skill set that comes with being a founder, and there's a different level of considerations and stress that come with being a founder that is different from being a CEO, whether you're a founder and CEO or just like the CEO of PepsiCo, right? Anyways, the point being, I think I kind of hate the term founder coaching, but like some people have said like, oh, this founder coaching is really valuable. And it's a lot of it is around the hard stuff that comes to founders. And there's business stuff there, and these types of conversations that we're having. And there's almost like a level 2 of like part therapist. And like, if you're a founder and you need help, you should like see a therapist. But there's something different about another founder who has been there before, who's felt that stress before, because like as good as your therapist is, they weren't a founder. And so I think there's something really interesting there that feels like it's resonating with people and it's kind of organically happening. And so I'm keen to continue on that path, kind of wherever it takes me, at least for a little while.
I am so aligned to the fact that people don't really tell the true stories. Everything's revisionist history a little bit. It's very selective. And if you only see the good, and on social media, and if it's only up and to the right, then when you're the founder who's not dealing with up and to the right, you literally think I'm in the minority. You think the problem I'm having right now, is the very few. When in actuality, it's the flip. It's the reverse. And I see it now in the last year when I go speak. I'm super transparent, and these are the challenges I had at this company. These are the challenges, and people will do the same thing. They'll come up, man, thank you so much for bringing that up. I'm having that exact same problem, and doesn't seem like anyone else is. I'm like, actually, everyone is. It's just that people aren't talking about it. So I meant what I said in the intro, and what you and I have talked about recently is like, I just think that what you're doing, is really, it's going to make a big difference to a lot of people, and if it may not be hundreds of thousands of people, but the people who do read it, I think it's a really it's going to be really powerful for them. And so anyway, I love that you're doing it. Do you look? This is something I've been wondering, and you and I have talked about the podcast and having people on here that are, in a similar situation. Have you found other founders who have shut down their companies that are willing to share? Like, as you've been sharing, like, are people being like, I want to also share, or because I don't see it. I don't see it a lot on social media. I don't see, I actually don't actually know any other founder, frankly, other than you, talking about this and being open about it. I'm sure they exist, but do you know of many? Do they reach out to you?
The answer is I've talked with some. I haven't talked with tons. I think we should do it more. And I do think that should change. I think, so the short answer is yes, but we certainly need more of it. And I think we need more of these like really brutally honest conversations. And again, I think there's a lot of reasons, for that, but yeah, I've talked with, let's say, a handful of founders, and one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how do we get more voices, around the table, more voices to talk about this? Because to your point, it's like if 80% or whatever the number is of startups fail, all we listen to are the founders that won. Well, then what are we doing? Like, it's like, where did all of those lessons go? They just evaporate, and we have to like reinvent the wheel on them over and over again. I mean, that's crazy.
Last question. If you could go back, and actually in your case, I'm saying all the way back to the beginning of your career, knowing everything you know today, what piece of advice would you give yourself?
That your life and your career is not a straight line up and to the right.
So if people want to connect with you, what is the best way for them to do that? If they want to, reach out to you, talk to you, you already mentioned the Failing Forward, but is LinkedIn the best way? Email?
Yeah, so if you actually go to the Failing Forward Substack, there's like an about page that has my LinkedIn and my like email. So like you can just find it there. But you can just Google me, Nicholas Freund. And one of the things I've managed is to be the number one entry on myself. So like I should pop up right there at the top of Google. You can find me on LinkedIn. So you can reach out to me that way too. But it's pretty straight. That's how you do it.
Awesome. Nick, I really appreciate you doing this. I think people are going to enjoy this, appreciate this, learn a lot from this. So thank you very much. And, I look forward to the next company that you start, and, chance of that being a success is going to be much, much higher. So, I'm excited for that.
Thanks for having me, David. It was a lot of fun, and I hope it was helpful to anyone who listened to it today. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, please share it with your networks. Please like, subscribe, and we'll see you for the next episode of Not Another CEO Podcast. That's a wrap for this week's episode of Not Another CEO Podcast. Thanks for joining. For show notes and more, please visit notanotherceopodcast.com. We'll see you next week.